So we're going to be talking about two great cameras in the Sony cinema lineup, and that is the FX2 versus the FX30. Now, if you don't have either of these cameras and you're looking to get into the cinema line, which one are you going to choose? The APS-C version, the FX30, or the full frame FX2, which is brand new, has just dropped? Which one's best for you? Let's get it. So first of all, we got to be talking about the price. Now, the price local in Australia is going to be different when it comes to the conversion of the price in the US. And currently you can get the FX30 for about $32.99 Australian dollars or the FX2 for $52.99 Australian dollars. And in the US, you got the FX30 for $1,799 or you got the FX2 for $26.99 US. So the price has to be taken into massive consideration first. So right from the start, we have to talk about the sensor size. Now, the FX30 is a Super 35 sensor, whereas the FX2 is a full frame sensor. So we've got a Super 35 26 megapixel sensor versus a full frame 33 megapixel sensor. Well, the main differences between the sensor sizes right now comes down to the price, but also the lenses. We have to talk about the lenses. So full frame lenses are generally more expensive than Super 35 or APS-C lenses, mainly for the fact that the full frame lenses cover a larger sensor, which means larger glass. Now, if you are looking at the Sony G-Master lenses, well, essentially, they are the cream of the crop. They are the best lenses you can get in the Sony range, whereas the APS-C lenses are still absolutely fantastic, but they are much cheaper, especially if you are getting the full frame equivalent lenses in the Super 35 modes. Now, the main standout difference between the FX30 and the FX2 happens to be that EVF. Now, the FX2 has a tilting EVF from 0 degrees all the way up to 90 degrees. Now, a lot of people aren't going to be using the EVF, but there are some minor situations where if you're in bright situations, you might want to look through the EVF, check your shot. You might want to reframe your shot a little bit more. If you've got a shoulder mounted rig or it's on a tripod, you could be utilizing EVF, whereas the FX30 does not have an EVF. But the one good thing about the FX30 is it does have a better, more high resolution back screen than the FX2. Now, when it comes to the cards on the sides, the FX30 has two Type A cards on the side, plus they are also SD cards, whereas the FX2 only has one Type A, and then that one has an SD card as well, but you have a second SD card slot. So it's a little bit different. The FX30 is a little bit better when it comes to the card slots. Now, they both do support that FC100 battery, which is absolutely fantastic. You'll most likely need one or two of these for a whole day of shooting. They are incredible batteries in these Sony cameras. Now, one great thing when it comes to the audio options is they both use the identical top handle. So you can actually put professional XLR inputs directly in here, or you can actually utilize the input 3, which essentially is your 3.5 audio jack. But both of the bodies themselves have the 3.5 audio jack in, but also a headphone jack out as well for monitoring. So they're pretty much identical when it comes to the audio options in the FX30 and the FX2. Now, one thing I do love about both of these cameras is that they do have a zoom rocker at the top. So if you do pair it with a power zoom lens, you can do some really nice zoom in and zoom out. And especially if you don't want to actually utilize the zoom ring on the lens itself, it's just a great feature to have. Now, when it comes to raw recording into an Atomos Ninja 5, they both do that externally. But when it comes to the full frame mode on the FX2, you can't record raw externally full frame. You have to go to that Super 35 crop mode. So essentially, they're both Super 35 sensors when it comes to recording ProRes RAW into the Atomos Ninja 5. Now, they both do have the fantastic feature where you can actually stream through the USB-C. That is great. The FX3 doesn't have this, but the FX30 and the FX2 does. And the A7 IV that you guys are seeing right now has that. And I absolutely love using my A7 IV for my Zoom calls. So you can do that with the FX30 and the FX2. Now, one brand new feature that's actually come to the Cine line is essentially that you can take stills in the S-Log profile. So essentially, if you do want to go location scouting, you can actually utilize that S-Log photo, and then you can put a specific LUT on top to see what that LUT would be in that specific location. It's quite nice for people who do professional shoots and location scouting, just to see what their colors would look like in that very particular situation. And the FX30 does not have this, so it's only in the FX2 as we speak. Now, one of the things we do see that is different when it comes to the build design is the actual fan itself. The FX30 doesn't have the fan on the actual back, whereas the FX2 has the fan on the back, and you've got a couple of vents at the top and the bottom and the side. So when it comes to the heating, it's probably going to be a little bit better in the FX2, but both of these are going to be great for long durations in recording, so interviews, Zoom calls, video podcast, or just long recording days. Now, they both do have full-size HDMI, which is absolutely fantastic, and I love that as a professional feature, because if you are utilizing external monitors, having full-size HDMI is just a larger, more secure cord. Now, one pro with the FX2 is that you have the home button, which brings up the Big 6 menu. Now, at the time of recording this, the FX30 doesn't have that Big 6 menu, but there will be a firmware update that will bring that Big 6 menu to the FX30, to the FX3, and to the FX6. The FX2 right now has that, which is absolutely fantastic. It has all the functions that you need when it comes to quick access in that one screen. Now, one pro that both of these cameras have are the tally lights. Now, tally lights are obviously great to let you know that you are recording. So you do have one on the front, you've got the back, you've also got the record button, but then you also have the box around the screen that shows you are recording as well, which is fantastic in these cinema cameras. Now, the brilliant thing about the FX2 is that it does come with that AI processor. Now, that comes with a whole bunch of different features that the FX30 doesn't have. Now, the AI processor brings dynamic active stability. Now, dynamic active stability essentially is more digital stabilization on top of your standard active stabilization that the FX30 has. This crops in at about 30%. It's pretty significant, but you get incredible stabilization over the standard active stability. Now, this is on top of the actual IBIS itself. Now, IBIS is your in-body image stabilization. Essentially, the sensor moves around to try to counteract all the bounces, and the digital stabilization is on top of that. Now, the FX30 only has active stability, which is still perfectly fine, but if you do want really incredible stabilization, dynamic active stability is going to work better in the FX2, or just get a gimbal. Now, if you do like just using the IBIS, the FX30 actually has 5.5 stops of stabilization, whereas the FX2 only has 5 stops of stabilization. So the IBIS is a little bit stronger in the FX30. But like I said before, you do have that AI processor that allows for better digital stabilization in the FX2. Now, also with that AI processor, it gives you frame stabilizer, which is fantastic. If you are walking and talking, it's going to be cropping in just like dynamic active stability and framing your character in the center frame, or you can choose it to be framed in the thirds, which is a great feature. And similarly, you do actually have auto reframing. So if essentially you want to do this kind of talking to camera, you can actually utilize that with 3 different crop sizes. And it just makes it look like you have a videographer filming you, which is fantastic. And being a 33 megapixel sensor, nice high resolution and detailed, you're not going to really lose too much resolution as you kind of do with the ZV-E1. But it's still going to work fantastic, and it just looks nice and dynamic. And if you don't know how to do this in post-production, well, it does this in camera in the FX2. And lastly, with that AI processor, you get the new autofocus features, which focuses on a whole bunch of cars, planes, trains, and obviously people and animals and insects. But this actually just gives you a little bit more stickiness when it comes to, trying to keep everything in focus and just understanding how people move, understanding how cars and trains are shaped, which is going to be better in the FX2 over the FX30. Now, the last AI processor feature in the FX2 is that if you tilt the camera on the side, all your monitoring details are going to tilt with the camera, which obviously is a great feature. The FX30 just doesn't have that. Now, one body design feature that we do see that's a little bit different in the FX2 is the actual mounting on the bottom. So the FX2 gives you 2 mounting points at the bottom, whereas the FX30 only gives you 1. So obviously that's going to be great when it comes to mounting it on tripods, on gimbals, and it's not going to be pivoting around, which is a great win for the FX2. Now, a great feature that I absolutely love using is a record button on the front. Now, they both have a record button on the front, which is great because you have a record button at the top, you got the one on the front, but you can also program the record button to be the shutter button as well. Really depends on your workflow, but it's just great that they also include that on the front there. Okay, now let's talk about the image quality differences. I mean, the FX30 is still a fantastic sensor. It looks absolutely incredible when it comes to the image quality in 4K 25 frames per second. In 4K 60, same again, it looks incredible. Now we do have a crop when it comes to the 4K 60 in the FX2, so it brings it a very similar framing in terms of that Super 35 frame. And this is where the rolling shutter performance actually performs very similar as well in that Super 35 crop mode. But if you are in the full frame mode on the FX2, the rolling shutter performance is about 26 milliseconds, whereas the 4K 25 on the FX30 is roughly about 15 milliseconds. So it is a bit faster. And if you are doing a lot of sports and action, you might see a little bit of a difference with the rolling shutter between the FX30 and the FX2. But when it comes to controlling the depth of field, you're always going to get more control out of a full frame sensor than you will with an FX30 Super 35 sensor because of how the science works behind a full frame sensor. And generally, you're going to get better low light performance out of a full frame sensor than you will with a Super 35 sensor. Now, this is definitely a camera to camera situation, but we do see better low light performance in the FX2 over the FX30. Now, if we do boost it up to 12,800, you can see the difference between the FX2 over the ZV-E1/FX3 sensor to the FX30 sensor. You can see there's a lot more noise at 12,800 in the FX30 over the 12,800 in the FX2. Now, we do have to talk about 4K 120 frames per second, and that's one thing that the FX30 has and the FX2 doesn't. Now, if you do want to film at 120 or 100 frames per second, you're going to have to go into that 1080p with 8-bit color in the FX2, whereas the FX30 has 10-bit 422 with 4K 120 frames per second, but there is an additional 1.5 times crop on top of that 1.5 times crop sensor. So if you do have a pretty significant crop when you go directly onto the FX30, and the sensor is a little bit noisier in that 4K 120. But in saying that, the 1080p, even though it's 8-bit in the FX2, still pretty decent. Not gonna lie, if it's lit correctly, it will work perfectly fine. Now, they both work in that Cine EI workflow as well, being in the Cine line, which is absolutely fantastic. If you don't know what that is, there's tons of videos out there explaining what Cine EI does, but essentially it gives you those two base ISO levels that has the best dynamic range and the best signal to noise ratio. Now, when it comes to the dual base ISOs, the FX30 has 800 and 2500, whereas the FX2 has 800 and 4000. Now, I do believe in my personal experience, 800 and 4000 is much more usable when it comes to those two base ISO levels compared to the 800 and 2500. And look, when it comes to the dynamic range between these two cameras, the FX2 is going to be a little bit better, maybe about a stop better. And if you don't know what dynamic range is, essentially it's capturing the most amount of highlights and shadow detail as possible within the camera. The FX2 is just going to do a little bit better, and especially if it's in low light situations, you're going to get cleaner shadows out of the FX2 than you will with the FX30. Now, this next one is a significant difference because the FX2 has a mechanical shutter and gives us 10 frames per second in stills, whereas the FX30 is an electronic shutter and you only have single shot stills. So when it comes to photography and being a hybrid camera, the FX2 is far better than the FX30. Now, when it comes to monitoring LUTs, you can actually load 16 LUTs directly in both of these cameras. So if you do want to monitor your own personal LUT or a LUT that you've purchased and just see what the image might look like in post-production, you can load them on both of these cameras, and that's obviously a fantastic feature. Now, if you are filming anamorphics with both of these cameras, you can do that. You have a 1.3 or a 2 times desqueeze in the camera, but you do actually lose stabilization. So you can't actually utilize the IBIS, which is perfectly fine because generally you don't want to use stabilization with anamorphic lenses unless the camera actually actively stabilizes with anamorphic lenses. But if you have a 1.5 or a 1.6 times anamorphic lens, well, this is where you're just going to have to use a monitor to desqueeze that inside the monitor itself. So look, overall the FX2 kind of wins in a lot of different situations over the FX30, but the FX30 is a fantastic camera, brilliant for cinematography, filmmaking, and people wanting to get into the Sony Cine line. The FX30 is a fantastic option, but now the FX2 that is here for this kind of price in the US, it kind of does make sense, but in Australia, it's a very expensive camera at the moment. That's the time of the release at the moment, but it's still a fantastic camera if you place it in between the FX30 and the FX3. So anyway, my friends, I hope you found this video useful. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. I'll obviously put a link in the description below for the FX30 and the FX2, but let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, let's get it.